There we go.
Yeah, it's reading children's stories is really special, and love history ones. We have a new Rosa Parks one, and that's been a great one. And so
And this kid is 3 months old, so
yeah, so
yeah.
Very advanced.
Starting history early.
I love it. Looking forward to reading books to my little one when they come. I've been collecting the board books from the little free libraries around my neighborhood. So
Yeah, because they're so short, and then you read the same ones over and over. So you want to have a lot of them to vary things, and but it is amazing, even at 10 weeks, where I don't think she does like language or anything, but like just something about the page in front of her. She's very she's really intent. She's quite captivated, very alert with it, and I think she understands there's something I'm telling that's related to, I don't know, maybe she just is seeing light and whatever, but she really does look at it. So I think the brain synapses, things are developed and things happen. It's a really nice bonding time.
Yeah, but question time has been inadequate. So
yeah.
Well, I will say, as a former children's librarian, the idea at that age is that they are getting print literacy. So they're learning how books work, learning how pages turn, and eventually she'll be interested in turning the pages herself. And it just all builds a love and a comfort of books. So
Cool.
And color.
Yeah, you are the expert on this, so yeah. So you actually know the science behind it. Yeah.
I forget at what age it is, but very early on they can't really see color, so the black and white board books are really best. Like high contrast, and there's plenty of them. Town of Hoban has a bunch, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I read that they it's maybe around 3 months they start adding some colors into what they see. So we have these different black and white designs on a little page, and you just hold it in front of her, and it's that's pretty entertaining, I think, to a baby.
Which is one reason why we got Paul a zebra when he was very, very young.
And we have 2 tuxedo cats, so we like to say that she must love seeing Reggie and Buster. She could really that has some cool contrast for her.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, I'm gonna just go ahead and do the intro, and then whoever comes in later can join as they see fit. All right. So welcome to tonight's program with Stephen Kendrick and Paul Kendrick, authors of 9 Days, The Race to Save Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life and Win the 1960 Election. My name is Amy Lou Stowe, and I'm the Community Outreach Librarian here at the Belmont Public Library. Thank you for being here, and to the Friends of the Library for helping make this event possible. I invite you to get in touch with me with any questions or program ideas, and I'll put my email address and phone number in the chat. Please also fill out our survey at the end, and I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. Just to note that we are recording tonight's session. We'll have some time for questions and answers at the end, but feel free to put your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll start with those. Without further ado, Stephen Kendrick and Paul Kendrick are the co-authors of 9 Days, The Race to Save Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life and Win the 1960 Election. They have written 2 previous books, Douglas and Lincoln, How a Revolutionary Black Leader and a Reluctant Liberator Struggled to End Slavery and Save the Union, and Sarah's Long Walk, The Free Blacks of Boston, and How Their Struggle for Equality Changed America. Stephen recently became Minister Emeritus of First Church Boston, Unitarian Universalist, after 20 years as senior minister. He is the author of The Lively Place, Mount Auburn, America's First Garden Cemetery and its Revolutionary and Literary Residents, Holy Clues, The Gospel According to Sherlock Holmes, and Night Watch, a novel. Paul is the executive director of Rust Belt Rising, a political training organization, as well as an adjunct professor at the National Louis University in Chicago. Paul served in President Obama's White House and on his 2012 Wisconsin campaign. He was previously the director of college success at the Harlem Children's Zone. Please help me welcome Paul and Stephen Kendrick.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you to the folks at the Belmont Library for making the outreach, and we appreciate being asked to participate. As you were noting our portfolio of the books we've worked on, I noted two things. One is we like really long subtitles. And the other is that Paul and I care deeply about the cultural interface between white and Black in American life and in our politics and in what makes us a democratic experiment. There's a tragic element to our democratic experiment. We're seeing it all around us right now, but it's always been there. It's always been present. Sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better, but generally it's just hidden away and or exposed. And there have been brief moments in our history, which has been inspirational and has also been tragic, where there is an opening, there's an opportunity for white and Black to cooperate, to see each other more accurately, perhaps more understandably, and with understanding and forgiveness. We would like there to be more such opportunities, but when those opportunities have arisen, Paul and I have wanted to seize on them and expose them. And one thing that we've learned along the way is that you can't be terribly sentimental about them. This book that we have worked about 5 years on is an inspirational book. That's true. And you might even say that it has, in the short run, a happy ending. Yes, Martin Luther King's life was saved. He was able to be freed from Reedsville prison. And he went on as a relatively young man, untested at the beginning of his civil rights career. This is all before Selma. It's all before the March on Washington. It's all before Memphis. And had Martin Luther King died in 1960, right before the presidential election between Kennedy and Nixon, and not only would our civil rights history would be different, but we would remember King differently. We would remember him as a relatively young man who had a successful Montgomery bus boycott under his belt. And then what? And then think of what still lay ahead of him. So it was an important element in our national life that 3 members of the Kennedy campaign went rogue. Neither Nixon nor Kennedy really wanted to engage with Martin Luther King's arrest. Paul's going to tell us a lot more about this story in a few minutes, and has some pictures of some of the protagonists that we've written about, and frankly have really mostly come to admire. Even Nixon is not quite the Nixon that we remember as essentially the creator, the evil genius of the Southern strategy. Nixon in 1960 is perceived as a fairly liberal civil rights sympathizer, and is actually a friend of the King family. A lot of people don't remember that Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, endorsed Nixon the day before his son was arrested at Rich's department store, and then went into essentially 9 days of ultimate peril. So it affected the campaign in drastic ways. This is in some ways the original October surprise, before the term October surprise was even thought of or invented. When something like this happens immediately before an election, it can change everything. And this election was an unusual one. There had been closer elections in American history, but there's never been an election that was so close in so many states in every part of the country. And so it galvanized America in 1960. Basically anything, this thing was on a knife edge, and anything could have changed it or turned it. And so Nixon and Kennedy were very wary of touching this. This was a live wire. This young activist who was only, 31 years old at the time, his life was on the line, and so was the presidency. And so much changed. Now, this incident is in many campaign biographies or biographies of the Kennedy brothers or Nixon or King, is often a paragraph. But Paul and I discovered, Paul, and to give him full credit, discovered transcripts and letters, all kinds of documentation that really give it a almost minute by minute and also conversation by conversation ability to kind of go granular, to really find the drama, to find really what this story meant to American life. And so much changed. Yes, King's life was saved, and that's good. He would meet his fate later on, but he accepted in 1960 the trajectory of his life and his career, what he might have to sacrifice to try to save the soul of America. But also, so much else changed, and we'll talk about that as our evening concludes. We have a lot of interest in this story because it engaged us. It engaged our wonderment, our wanting to write this story. We got to meet some of the characters, the incredible characters who were still alive. We were able to interview some of them. Two of them died, actually. Two of the most important people we interviewed actually died after our interviews and before publication. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So we caught some of this story literally just before it was ready to be obliterated. And to get these interviews, to go back to the oral histories, to find long lost transcripts of Martin Luther King's trial, all this allowed us to create what we think is a dramatic story, and an important story, and an American story. So I'm going to turn this over to my co-author. Paul and I have, as Amy has noted, have written 3 books together, and we really, really care about these issues. But we care about them in a sense of an excitement of the narrative, the story. And you're going to get to see the faces of some of the important people that make up this drama, these 9 days where so much was at stake, not just a presidency, but a man's life. So Paul, what do you want to say?
Stephen mentioned, my dad mentioned how, we've written, this is our 3rd book together, and obviously it's uncommon to have a father-son writing duo. Most people didn't even like their parents, checking their homework. But we have a real partnership out of it, a shared love of history and the belief that it's important for us to learn from today, to draw on with clear eyes. And this story began, so you are friends in Belmont here. So my father lived in downtown Boston for the last 20 years. And so that's where they moved to after I went off to college, but I tracked them down. I found where they were. And so our next door neighbor in Boston said to us, "You should meet my mentor, Harris Wofford. Paul, you're really passionate about civil rights. You really love history. You should talk to Harris." So this was Harris Wofford. And his mentor had a pretty uncommon American life, a pretty unique role. We sometimes call him like the Forrest Gump of social change in America, who was always there at the right moment. And so I started spending time with Harris. I lived in Washington, D.C. at the time, and his stories are amazing. His experiences, his life, and as my dad kind of put together, wow, so Harris worked on the Kennedy campaign. Harris had been a white advisor to Dr. King, who goes to work on the Kennedy campaign and is instrumental in helping get King out of this perilous imprisonment and part of shifting the black vote in America to help elect Kennedy. That's a book that, you know, it's always mentioned in books, as he said, but that should be a full tale, a single volume, exciting piece of nonfiction narrative. And Harris was enthusiastic about that, and so it started recording his stories. And you know, with Harris, he had traveled to India as a teenager, become passionate about Gandhiism, about nonviolence, civil disobedience. He had then, when he'd gone to a black law school, which made family members faint, of a white person doing that in the late 1940s, and he went to Howard Law School, and then he wrote about civil disobedience, how it could maybe transform the racial caste system of America. But then he heard a 26-year-old minister in Montgomery, Alabama, was actually doing it. And so he started writing to Martin Luther King, became a friend, an advisor to King, because they shared this love of what the approaches of Gandhi how it might change America. And so for Harris, Dr. King was not the statue that was near his house, which was in the west end of Washington, D.C., right near the King Memorial. But King was a friend who he missed. King was a human, a person. And so Harris helped us start telling this story, but a real joy of writing it. And here's Harris in the Kennedy administration, because after the events of this book, he goes to work on civil rights in the Kennedy White House, and then would help found the Peace Corps, and go on to a fascinating career from there, and eventually U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, and running national service programs. And then after 50 years of being married to the woman he loved, who sadly passed away from cancer, fell in love with a man, and in his 90s married the man he loved. And so just an amazing, amazing life. And Harris passed away 2 years ago.
That's on Martin Luther King Day.
On Martin Luther King Day. And so Harris started helping us tell the story of his team of civil rights advisors on the Kennedy campaign. And that got us really interested in his teammate, Louis Martin. And so Louis and Harris and the third member of their team, you'll meet in a second, their friendship kind of forms the heart of the book. And our sense that Louis Martin is an American hero that more people should learn about, and is really fun to learn about, because Harris and Louis had a lot of fun together, and they were really funny, and they were willing to risk everything, their careers, an election, to try to do the right thing. And so they are real people to learn from. And so Louis Martin was the editor of the Chicago Defender. And essentially, Harris had been placed in charge of Black outreach for the Kennedy campaign. And he and his boss, Sergeant Shriver, realized that they really needed someone known and respected in Black communities across the country for this. And so they recruited Louis to come join the campaign from Chicago. And that turned everything around, because Louis Martin was so savvy and strategic and kind of a hard-nosed political operator, in a way that Harris, the idealistic white liberal, didn't know as much about, kind of how to really get things done in the different parts of the country, or in Black neighborhoods that they had to turn out, because at the time, we have to take you into a different world in the 1960 election. It looked like the Black vote would split about 50-50. And Louis Martin really believed Black voters could become Democrats. And he set out to really make that happen. And Louis Martin's daughters helped us tell this story. He had passed away about 20 years ago, but they shared our sense that he's an American hero who orchestrated a lot of change over the 1960s that should be known about. Here you see him as an advisor to President Johnson, as an advisor to President Kennedy. He was kind of a presidential whisperer. They call him the godfather of Black politics. And so they really helped us bring Louis to life in this book. And so they're working. The third member of this trio is their boss, Sergeant Shriver. Some of you've probably heard of Shriver, remember him. He was the Kennedy in-law, and they called him the too liberal in-law, or the House Communist, because Sergeant Shriver was really passionate about social justice issues. He was really passionate about trying to defeat racism in America. And that left the Kennedy brothers a little wary of their sister's husband. And if he, he had an important role in the campaign, but what was he going to do? Is he going to kind of follow his heart too much? And so, but Shriver was an amazing person at making things happen. And of course, he goes on to found the Peace Corps, and with his wife Eunice, the Special Olympics, and just made a lot of change in American life. And the war on poverty, etc. So, these three are in charge of figuring out if Nixon wins 50% of the black vote, he's going to win the election. And so these three really believe the black vote matters, but no one else in the Kennedy campaign really thinks that, because they're just because Nixon wants to flip the South that's been voting Democrat, and Kennedy needs to hold on to it. So the last thing anyone wants to do is speak up for civil rights very much. But these three really believe, what? Black voters could be really critical in a close election. They could make the difference. And right now, they don't know or like this Massachusetts senator who seems aloof and accommodationist to Dixiecrats. How are we going to win black voters over? And they decide they're going to run a substantive civil rights issue-oriented campaign instead of just the usual kind of celebrities and just kind of the usual playbook. They're going to run something different. And they do that, but everything kind of gets upended 3 weeks before the 1960 election. And that's the beginning of the 9 days. And that, for us, took us to Atlanta. And we developed a friendship that we really treasured with this man, Lonnie King, who was the leader of the Atlanta student movement. And Lonnie, it's a great story of how the Atlanta student movement started, because he read about the sit-ins in North Carolina, and he said to a fellow student in kind of a pharmacy, Julian Bond, "Do you think someone will do that here?" And Julian Bond said, "Yeah, I'm sure someone will do that here." And he goes, "All right, we'll call a meeting for tonight. You take that side of the cafe, I'll take this side of the cafe, and let's." Essentially, they just started organizing. And so that's Lonnie. Lonnie had just a indefatigable, indelible spirit where he's so dynamic, and he grew up with Martin Luther King. He was part of Dr. King's church, and so he's a student at Morehouse. Here he is talking to students from the historically black colleges of Atlanta, Spelman, Clark, and he creates this movement with other student leaders for sit-ins, and they decide that it's so frustrating. These presidential candidates don't want to talk about this injustice of segregation that's going on. So we need to force people to talk about our issue. And we're going to do a sit-in 3 weeks before the 1960 election. But if our increasingly famous friend Martin Luther King goes to jail with us, then people will really have to talk about our issue. And so, it's an incredible lesson in activism of how, a lot of times politicians don't want to engage on controversial things, and the agenda has to be forced. But they had to convince Dr. King to do this, because Dr. King had just moved home to Atlanta from Montgomery. This 31-year-old Dr. King Martin Luther King was worried he was going to be a one-hit wonder. He'd had the Montgomery bus boycott 4 or 5 years before, and now everyone's like, okay, so now solve America, desegregate America, like you did with these buses in Montgomery. And he didn't know how he was going to do it. And so Dr. King was really struggling. So he moves home, and then suddenly these students are like, hey, we were inspired by you. We have a new approach about sitting in and going to jail. You've never gone to jail overnight, Dr. King, and we want you to do it with you. And so in the book, there's, I think, a powerful scene of Lonnie's confrontation with Dr. King and Dr. King's father, who did not want Dr. King to go to jail. I mean, it's a radical thing to do, to go to jail in the South as a Black person in 1960. And Dr. King's dad had a lot of reasons that he didn't want his son putting his life in danger, and he had a young family, and creating civil strife in Atlanta when Dr. King's father was a leader, and he kind of was like, we don't want these young kids and you disrupting things, let the old folks, handle this. And young people have an impatience that needs to be listened to, as they speak up for what's right. So Lonnie convinces Dr. King to do this. And then on October, and my father alluded to this, but it's really important context that's hard to kind of get through our heads, that at this moment, Nixon is the friend of King's. The King family was going to vote for Nixon. Black Atlanta was going to vote for Nixon. Nixon was going to get half of the Black vote. He was seen as more sympathetic than Kennedy to civil rights. Here's Nixon meeting Dr. King in Ghana in their independence celebration a few years before, that started a friendship. That he had King to his office in DC to advise on civil rights legislation. So the students figured Nixon would speak up for Dr. King. Dr. King expected his friend Nixon to speak up for him. That's not what happened. But you meet in the book Nixon's Black advisors, who really had a vision of the Republican Party as the leader on civil rights, of Black people, being, Republican voters. And so you meet the baseball legend Jackie Robinson, who in retirement was going all over America for Nixon, and the first Black White House advisor in the Eisenhower Republican White House, a man named E. Frederick Morrow. And so they're, when we call it the race to save Martin Luther King's life, they're in a race to get Nixon to speak out during these 9 days, because then they think the future might be Republicans leading on civil rights. So on October 19th, Dr. King and 51 students are arrested at Rich's department store. And this is a very vivid scene we got so much detail on this we were able to find through newspapers and interviews and oral histories that, this scene is it's pretty novelistic, I think, of how this sit-in happened at the Crown Jewel department store of the South, Rich's in downtown Atlanta. And so there's our friend Lonnie with Dr. King, with a student, Marilyn Price, and then another student, Blondine Orbert, as they are arrested and taken away to jail. So, but there was something Dr. King didn't really understand, and this is why it becomes such a dangerous story, because Dr. King had been racially profiled a few weeks before. And when he moved home to Georgia, he didn't update his license. He still had an Alabama license. It's not like the first thing you do when you move home. But a judge used that to put him on probation, but he didn't understand he was on probation. And but this judge in the neighboring DeKalb County, who was a white supremacist, hears, "Oh, Dr. King has been arrested. I want him in my courtroom." And so he's able to take custody of Dr. King after a few days of wrangling. That's fascinating, the book, of how the students got soon after a few days were released, and they had been enjoying the time in jail at that point together. It was like a nonviolence retreat. But Dr. King is taken alone to what King's family called Klan country of DeKalb County. Today, DeKalb is a diversifying suburb. Then it was like Klan country. So this is King being taken from Atlanta to DeKalb, to Decatur, and so he would soon stand trial. And as my dad alluded to, we found the transcript that had never been in a book from this trial, and how a judge sentenced King to 4 months hard labor in the rural Georgia State Prison of Reidsville. And this was the time when Dr. King's family most feared for his life. Daddy King was told, that they can just quietly kill your son there. And Dr. King was awoken and put in chains later this night and put in the back of a police car. He thought he was going to his lynching. He thought he would never see his family again. And he's driven across Georgia, never told where he's going, but it was to this prison, Reidsville. But he's staring at, 4 months there. There are murders that happen at Reidsville all the time of Black men. We have documentation of that the guards were sadistic to Black men. And so at this point, Coretta King calls their friend Harris Wofford on the Kennedy campaign and says, they're going to kill Martin. I know they are. And Harris had already gotten the Kennedy campaign publicly involved in trying to get Kennedy out. Harris had kind of already gotten in trouble, but now he's really being called on to escalate things. The stakes have really risen. And he and Louis Martin will go out for a beer and essentially have an idea that, like, what if instead of trying to get a press release out, what if our Kennedy did something more human and personal? And they get Kennedy to call Coretta King. They get the idea to Shriver. Shriver gets the idea to Kennedy when he was
I think maybe
in American life. This sympathetic call to Coretta King. And so now the Kennedy campaign is fully engaged in this case of this controversial minister that, despite Nixon's advisors imploring, he is not speaking out on. Nixon is trying to flip the white Democratic South to the GOP. He believes he can do it. He's seen the crowds when he went down to Georgia. And so Nixon is staying quiet. And now Kennedy just called Coretta King. And Kennedy then starts kind of working behind the scenes, and his brother gets involved, the campaign manager, Bobby. And at that point, what we found kind of makes it like a spy novel. Like there's these back channels with these Georgia politicians who do not want to help Martin Luther King, but there are these, it is kind of a thriller of how, because of politics, they are able to work behind the scenes to get King home. And but you learn about King's lawyer, Donald Hollowell, who was another amazing American hero who would risk his life in the backwoods of Georgia defending Black men falsely accused of things, and so he's working to get King home. The students are working to King's families. They're all part of the race to save Martin Luther King's life. And but Hollowell is an amazing figure, and it will be Bobby and John Kennedy who Bobby had told our trio, Harris and Louis and Shriver, there not to do anything else. He screams at them, "You've lost us the election." But Bobby does start to think it's a real wrong that's happened to this young minister, and he will eventually shock our Mavericks by calling the judge, and they are able to get King home. And this was at King's funeral in 1968 of Bobby and Ethel visiting Coretta in their bedroom. But you learn how King gets home, how this 31-year-old's life is saved. Here's his family, his children, his sister, and the students waiting for him back in Atlanta when they get him home on a single engine plane from rural Georgia. And but then from there, there's one more very important thing that happens in the book that I want to mention, and you'll read the rest. That Louis Martin thought, I don't think my candidate's really gotten enough credit for doing something really bold and good. And so Louis has the idea, what if we make a pamphlet that tells the story and we get it out to Black voters? And Harris loves this idea. He immediately backs it. They call it Sergeant Shriver, who is in Illinois. And he's like, we're not even going to tell my brothers. I'll get you the money. I think this could win us the election, and if we don't win, my brothers will be unhappy. So let's just do it. And because he knows they probably wouldn't say yes to this. But what they're going to do is create millions of pamphlets that tell the story. Louis Martin was a journalist. He knows how to tell a story to get to the heart of things that works in politics. And they get it distributed throughout Black communities around the country so that white voters don't focus in on this, who don't like Martin Luther King. And but the voters they want to reach do. And so they we really loved how, Harris and Shriver just really trusted Louis Martin's idea, his experience, his expertise. And so, when the stakes were the highest in these last days of the election, they orchestrate, and it's, great scenes of how they get this blue bomb. That's what they called this pamphlet, distributed through Black America. And so the Black vote will shift 7 percentage points from the previous election, which ends up being crucial in the 1960 election is just close all over the country, and in these key states, in like 11 key states, that Black vote shift accounts for more than the difference of the margin. And so in this razor close election that we kind of described through election night, how this movement of Black voters that is then the kind of the decisive movement that, by 1964, you're going to have over 90% of Black voters vote Democrat. And then with Nixon's Southern strategy, by in the 68 and 72, he will flip the white South. And so we have this, we through these human characters, you learn about kind of how we get the politics we have today. And so, of course, Dr. King will need to keep pressing to get Kennedy to address civil rights, and before Kennedy's assassination, finally get behind civil rights legislation, and Louis Martin is going to be in there really working behind the scenes to make it happen. But as we see King and his family, it's a story that helps you understand King in a more human way, and what he had to do what was so uncomfortable, to do the courageous thing of going into a jail cell, facing it down alone, facing down that anxiety, and what these students did as they forced this issue. So, it's a story about people doing these bold things, a story about a team that listened to each other. And but what the good things that come out of courage when we do the things that we're ultimately afraid to do. So let me hand it back to Stephen for what you want to add to that. But that's the story that we found so thrilling.
And it is a thrilling story, and it takes Martin Luther King to the edge of mortality, and it reveals the divides which still plague us today. It was really interesting in the last election how, as the days after the election, DeKalb County came back into play. So in many ways, our story continues to the modern day. And in many ways, this story tells us what's possible in terms of idealism in political life. I think most of us sort of assume that politics is kind of a corrupt profession. We were delighted to be able to find people that not only used idealism as their chief weapon of choice, but that they enjoyed, through friendship and through connection, to be able to make a difference, such a profound difference in our American life. So yes, the election of Kennedy changed everything. Martin Luther King's career continued. And one of the poignant parts of the book for us at the end was that all these characters came back together in Memphis in 1968 at the funeral. Everyone was there. Nixon was there. Bobby was there. Sergeant Shriver was there. Harris was there. Louis Martin was there. And so these characters are reunited one last time by the figure of Martin Luther King Jr. And so it had a poignant and powerful quality. When we put this book together, it felt like an amazing story, the way it all came together. We didn't have to torture or manipulate. We just had to be true to the facts. And the more we discovered and the more we learned and the more we uncovered and discovered, the more it became clear that this story was kind of a miniature American Iliad. It's a story about our journey to who we could be and who we need to become. Um, yes, it is true that in 1960, Martin Luther King's family feared for his life in a way that they never had before. But nowadays we're now fearing for democracy itself. So it's good to be reminded of the power of decency and the ability of politicians and their staffs and reporters and anyone of powerful goodwill to be able to make these connections, to be reacquainted with the power of decency and what friendship and connection can do. Again, Paul and I are not interested in telling sentimental stories, but we are interested in finding stories that are positive, that give us a sense of this is who we could be. It's not impossible. There have been brief moments in our history where we rose above ourselves. It's not impossible. And when we came up with the ideas of this book, so many of our quandaries right now seemed unimaginable. And yet here we are. So we hope that our book can get out there. We hope that one of the participants that signed up for the Belmont Public Library is named Steven Spielberg. We think that this is an amazing story. And we hope that we can continue to find other stories like it and go from there. So I don't know whether folks have questions. We're happy to take some, and we're happy to continue talking about something that we love. We loved doing this book, and we're so happy that you came on board. I see Christine Robinson, who is a member of my previous congregation. Hello, Christine. How are you? And other folks who are here tonight. So if anyone has questions, we'd be delighted to take them.
Thank you both so much. There are no questions in the chat just yet, but feel free to type one in or to unmute yourself. And I will start. I learned a lot from your talk, so thank you so much. I was actually just having a conversation with somebody about HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities. So I was particularly interested to hear that Wofford went to Howard University. That's fascinating. So I was just talking with somebody about whether or not white people ever went historically or go now. I think it's become such a thing that they are a space where Black people can just be Black people and not have to, be performing for white people or, be representing their race for maybe oftentimes the first time in their life. So that's very interesting. You said he was there in the 40s. Is that right?
Yeah. I guess late 40s. Yeah, and I think he said that he was the first white graduate of Howard Law School that anyone knew of. So it was very uncommon. But for him, he felt, I want to make change in America, but it's too theoretical for me right now. I need to actually be in the community I want to work in and know Black life. And that impressed Louis Martin. He was very fascinated by this when he met this his partner in the campaign, who was this lawyer, this law professor that he'd gone to a Black law school. That's just so uncommon to meet someone like that in 1960. It would be today, but not as uncommon. But but that impressed Louis, and Bobby Kennedy was very flummoxed by that. He just thought it was the oddest thing he'd ever heard when he met Harris Wofford, and Harris was pretty insulted by that. But he came to really love Bobby Kennedy later. But that was I think is very laudable that Harris did have an understanding that it's not enough to just kind of talk about issues or just think that I have some magic that will just, make the world better. Like, I have to actually go and listen and learn and be part of a community and find ways that I can be useful. And he certainly did, whether it was raising funds for Dr. King to go to India and walking Gandhi's footsteps, or, helping Dr. King on his books. And then obviously in this book, helping pressure his presidential candidate to speak out to get King out and work behind the scenes. And then, later Harris would march and Selma and put his body on the line that way. So, Harris was always really willing to kind of show up and find ways to be valuable.
Just to remind you, earlier, it may have sort of passed you by that the Kennedy campaign had two white guys as head of their outreach to blacks. So this too is a part of an incredible revolution in the 1960 election, where basically Louis Martin comes in. And also on the Nixon side, they are not listened to, but they were there. They were speaking out. They were writing letters. They were trying their very best. We should not, in retrospect, with Nixon's later civil rights record, look back on Jackie Robinson and E. Frederick Morrow as having been dupes or fools. They were trying desperately to create a new kind of Republican Party. And they were trying desperately to get Nixon to listen to his own better angels. Again, think of how different American history would be had they been listened to. So, so part of this story is also the maturation of Black politics, and about how it is that we can reach today's politics. There's a lot that has shifted since 1960, and there's a lot that stayed the same. See, there are some more questions.
Yeah, well, Catherine's, thank you for asking about some of the women I'd love to talk about in the book, because we really wanted to make sure the story of the Spelman women was understood, because when people talk about this, like Kennedy credit, it's all about the politicians and maybe about Dr. King, but it was really, the courage of these Atlanta Black women, college students, who, when they went to jail, they faced additional traumas, as far as sexual assaults that happened in these, Jim Crow jails, that, were just traumas that were different than the traumas that, men had to dealt with.
And they represented the majority of the protesters.
Yeah. And so we were, I think it was really important to us to really get some of those stories into the book and help center these women students, in this story, and understand that none of this happens without the courage of the students. And again, as my father said, the majority of them were women, to put their lives on the line. And these are like freshmen who have just gotten to Spelman, and their parents have hoped and prayed and sent them off to college, and they get involved in a movement, and they become inspired to change a wrong in America and an injustice. And so, but they're really literally putting their lives, risking their lives to do it at 18 and 19. And so it's really incredible. So we loved learning about those stories, interviewing people, and making sure those stories are in the book. And there's a great book called Undaunted in the Fight about Spelman women that I really loved.
And we were very happy to get a blurb from Marian Wright Edelman, who was there, who was one of the Spelman women. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then obviously Coretta King is a really central character in the book, because she's, as I mentioned, puts that pressure on Harris that you have to do something more. They're going to kill Martin, and so this wasn't just about the politicians. It was a scared partner who was not only married to Martin Luther King, but was a partner in the movement, and was she would have gone to jail too, but she had to watch their two children. She was pregnant with their third, but on the outside she was helping to organize the pressure to get her husband home, and was going through, the fear of that. So Coretta's role, when we say that the race saved Martin Luther King's life, it's not just a race between Kennedy and Nixon. We wanted to change how history understands these 9 days, to see it as a race that Coretta King was part of, that the women of Spelman were part of, and so that was really important to us.
Right. Any more questions?
Yeah, and then so Lauren had a question about. Do you feel like there are correlations to some of the more recent presidential elections, either Biden or Obama? Really interesting. It was fascinating. As our book is coming out, the minister of Dr. King's church today is elected senator from Georgia. And if you're watching, CNN or MSNBC that night, they're talking about DeKalb County, where this diverse suburb where these votes are coming from for Reverend Warnock. And so but that Warnock's election is a real tribute to long-term organizing that Stacey Abrams and a lot of Georgia, particularly like Black women, had led over time, that to build change when people did not think it was going to be possible that a Black person and a Jewish person would be elected Democrats to represent Georgia. That organizing, which I think really speaks back to the Atlanta student movement organizing. And Lonnie, had a dream of this kind of thing happening. Lonnie said to us, the last thing I want to do on this earth is to help more, Black and Latino young people in Georgia register to vote. And Lonnie worked with Dreamers on how to use sit-ins, and so he saw the possibility for a change in Georgia, but ultimately there's so much we can learn from our civil rights elders to bring to the future. And so it was, organizing over time that changed Georgia. And certainly during the Biden election, I felt like we saw echoes of how a civil rights moment can change an election, because it was, in the Black Lives Matter movement that I think really clarified a lot of stakes, from Lafayette Square to, Kenosha, and both candidates really had an opportunity to stay, where they stood and what they're for. And it helped, I think, show a lot of people the differences. And Biden, really took that opportunity to say, hey, I want to, he developed this relationship with Jacob Blake's family, and I want to address systemic racism. And so I think he was kind of, in a sense, trying to show that heart that Kennedy did, and today we have lessons of, but hey, we got to keep pushing on our politicians to then address these things legislatively, and it's hard, and the filibuster's hard today, but we can't imagine the odds in 1961 and 62, and that Dr. King, after this experience, he then could go on to Birmingham and create the moral theater that would change America's understanding of the urgency of civil rights, and move a lot of hearts and minds, and shame people, and make someone like President Kennedy understand it, and make Louis Martin be able to, in the White House, say, hey, you got to address this and make it as clear as this TV. So lots and lots of echoes. And what's great is when people read the book, they give us new ones that we didn't think of. So I think reading about history helps us see our times with new eyes and new perspective, in this Black Lives Matter moment, and in the current politics we live in. So we hope you'll have thoughts from it.
And Mark Listow asked a question. It's a bit in-house, so I'm going to answer pretty quick. The notion that Coretta and Martin Luther King Jr. Were attracted to Unitarian Universalism. That is true. Their time in Boston certainly exposed them to that. Martin Luther King wrote his dissertation on the theology of Henry Nelson Wyman, a Unitarian theologian. But the reality is, Martin Luther King's dream was to go home. He felt that his work was going to be in the South, that's where the revolution had to start, and that's where the Gandhian principles would have to play out. And he was completely accurate in understanding that he needed the base. Unitarian Universalism would not have been that base. And he also had a mystical relationship after his home was bombed. Luckily, his child and wife were all right. But he had a mystical relationship in his kitchen one night where he felt literally the living presence of Christ. And I think that was an absolutely sincere moment of revelation. It sustained him through his despair and often very dark times. And that was very, very, very powerful for him. And so, yes, he spoke at one of our General Assemblies in Miami, I think about 3 years before he died. But was he a Unitarian Universalist? I don't think so. But he was a great liberal catalyst. And out of that, he was more than happy always to work not only with Unitarian Universalists, but with people like Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish prophet, and anyone else who was willing to march, willing to walk, willing to actually put their lives on the line. Because in the end, we put our souls on the line. And that's what it takes to build a nation out of many, one. So, well, I see that we are now at 7:59. We did pretty good there, Paul.
Oh, hey, Jerry. So good to see you. Thank you, Jerry, for being here. Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions?
I think you've got, one just came in.
Another one from Mark. What do you think of Dr. King's reputation in the current American moment when it seems like Malcolm X's star is on the rise? In a recent documentary, Cornel West says that Malcolm X was the freest Black man in America at his time. I think one thing that I hope readers get out of it is how the book is how radical Dr. King is and was, and because Dr. King has been so often co-opted to for people to just take one quote that he said about to taking the one quote about not judging the contents of the skin, and it's often used as kind of a repudiation of addressing racism today, and which is a misunderstanding of or comes from not reading everything Dr. King said over many years. And so but I think that almost makes Dr. King less I don't know that people might lose sight of kind of how bold and courageous he was, and hopefully not, but nonetheless, I think we're so used to photographs of civil rights leaders in jail that we take for granted really how radical some people didn't think Gandhiism could work in America because they thought it would be too suicidal to go to Jim Crow jails. And so Dr. King had to make that choice, and he so brilliantly used what I call like the moral theater of nonviolence to move hearts and minds is such an effective technique. And so sometimes people take nonviolence to just they just kind of miss the strategy. The point here it's not just about like the turning the cheek. It's about how we can move people to re-examine something they've lived with their whole life, and kind of seize the moral high ground and bring people to it. And so in Dr. King being able to make these changes that got a Civil Rights Act passed, that got a Voting Rights Act passed, that did change a lot of hearts and minds in America. It's worth remembering, because there's so much we need to do today for equality. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from him. But whoever people are inspired by in history is great. I'm not speaking of Dr. King at the expense of any other leader, but I just think there's a lot that can be missed. And my father and I were lucky enough to write a piece in the Washington Post a couple of years back about the radicalism at the end of King's life, and as he really diagnosed the things that were wrong in America, and he was still struggling to figure out how we're going to change it, and which we thought resonates with us, because we're always struggling of thinking about how we're going to do this, and just to know like Dr. King did too, and so that's okay, but he pushed forward out of kind of what could be despair, and so we have to do the same and find ways forward that we can make our country better.
And we can recommend a new book called The Sword and the Shield that talks about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. They only met once. There's a picture of them both smiling. And it is said that the Malcolm X turned towards King and said, if people pay attention to my radicalism, they'll pay more attention to you. And as both of them were martyrs, both of them died well before their time. But certainly when Malcolm X died, he was moving quickly towards positions held by Dr. King. And I want to just reinforce as we close that one of the things we need to emphasize about King is King was infinitely more radical than his reputation tells us. It's very difficult from our standpoint now. When you see Dr. King quoted in McDonald's commercials, you lose the sense that at the time, even at King's death, only 30% of the American population believed that Martin Luther King was a positive force in American life. That's how radical he was. And he still is radical. His economic vision more than goes beyond his work on racial equality. It's ultimately about human equality and economic equality and his going up against the Vietnam War. These were places where Malcolm X never had the chance to go, but King went there. He did. And so, yeah, we just want to really reinforce the greatness of King. One of the things we learned about writing a book about Frederick Douglass and Lincoln is just how great Frederick Douglass was. And one of the things we learned in writing this book is, yes, King's greatness is even more apparent to us, but also the fact that the civil rights movement is not just King. It's a full array of people, and the heroism that we were able to share in this book by characters who were largely unknown. They don't stand in the shadow of King. They illuminate King and everything that King gave to us. So,
yeah, my favorite interesting fact that I didn't know growing up is that Malcolm X was older than King. King died at 39, but everyone always thought he was older than he was. But Andrew Young said to me, Lauren and Catherine's comments made me think of this. King, it made no sense that he wanted to go to Memphis, but Andrew Young, his advisor, his confidant, said, but I think he knew his time was near and he wanted to be with working people when it happened. He didn't want to be with politicians. And so the fact that, King was murdered while standing up for, sanitation workers in Memphis, Andrew Young came to feel that was very apt because he was ultimately working on this, the intersection of inequalities in America. So there's just every time you read more King, you take more from it. We went in knowing he's a hero, but you just always learn more and get the insights in his writings and his speeches. They're just so genius. And so we enjoyed spending time with him and writing his book and spending time with those that knew him. Another one today passed away, Timuel Black, who I interviewed, was kind of his Chicago organizer, passed away today at 102 years old. This is the sixth or seventh person we interviewed for the book that we feel lucky to have known and tried to record things for history, but times we treasured with them. So hopefully we can learn from all of this and use it in our times.
So we tried to write a very idealistic book, but we do want to say Christmas is coming, and this makes a terrific gift.
And we want to say thank you to all of you for spending your Wednesday evening with us.
Thank you.
It really it means a lot, and Amy for organizing the Belmont Library. We really appreciate you.
Thank you
very much. And
nothing good happens without librarians. That is one thing we learned in writing this book. It helped us with everything and with this research.
Thank you both so much. This was wonderful. I'm going to put my contact information and the link to our feedback form in the chat again. So if you want to go ahead and click on that link so you don't lose it when the Zoom ends. But I will also send out the recording and the survey, the feedback form again, probably tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that, and feel free to send it to anyone who you know who would enjoy this talk and who maybe missed it. So thank you both so much, Stephen and Paul.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Have a nice night, everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Great to see you, Jerry. Thank you for getting on. Bye, Mark. Nice to meet you all.